Okay, well, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. From time to time, we like to showcase Glue's authentication partners, and Plurilock has done a really nice job integrating their authentication technology with Glue. So I don't want to give away anything that they're going to present right here, so I think I should just introduce Paul Baker, who's the Director of Sales from Plurilock. And Paul, why don't you take it away?
Thanks, Mike. Hi, everyone. I'm Paul Baker. I head up sales operations here at Plurilock, and I'm going to talk to you today about biometrics and Gluu and some of the cool things that we're doing here at Plurilock around that space. So, as I'm sure you know, Gluu gives you a really flexible and powerful identity platform that's built on common authentication and web standards that allows it to be easily incorporated into multiple different applications and systems. And this, coupled with things like single sign-on capabilities, means it's easier than ever for administrators and users to take advantage of digital identity. But identity today is difficult, and unfortunately, some past guidance has meant that the whole username and password thing can be difficult for users. And while the supercomputer in our head is amazing at many things, it really wasn't designed to be able to remember illogical and meaningless things such as multiple complex passwords. And this is a significant reason as to why we see these kinds of stats around identity, and they're pretty frightening, but really they're not that surprising either. More than 4 out of 5 of every breach is down to some kind of identity compromise, be that an easily guessed password or a password that's been stolen and is being used in stuffing attacks, or common passwords that are used in spraying attacks, or simply people not changing or sometimes not being able to change default passwords on devices. Because these password complexity rules are complex, users perform risky behaviors such as reusing passwords across accounts, and a stolen complex password is of course no more secure than any other password. And you can pretty much guarantee, unfortunately, that all of your users are going to be reusing passwords, and that's either between different corporate applications or between personal and work applications. And of course, the bad guys never rest. I'm sure you get daily attempts to get you to log into sites or open attachments from apparently valid addresses. And there are billions of attempted fraudulent logins every single year. And if we think to some of the recent breaches in financial institutions, it's unfortunate, but it happens. Capital One last year was a former software engineer who had some insider threat info. First American last year as well, which exposed over 880 million files that required no authentication at all to read them. Better Sure out of South Africa last year had an employee phished and then suffered a huge breach because of that. And there were multiple US credit unions had similar kind of spear phishing attacks last year. And then there's Simply and BMO and so on. And each breach of these sorts, really, regardless of the nature of them, makes it much more likely that a credential-based attack is going to occur in future. And worryingly, because of things like password reuse, theft or breaches of any site can mean that your users are compromised even though you were never directly breached. So to try and compensate for this and to add a layer of security that doesn't just rely on the performance limitations of the complex blob of cells, water, and squishy stuff, organizations need to use additional security on top. And typically this comes in some form of multi-factor authentication or MFA. And it's been proven to help immensely with these credential type of attacks. And yet only 11% of all enterprise accounts are actually protected with an MFA. And I want to try and dig into that a little bit further as to see why that's the case. So typically when we think about securing our users, we first think about our high-risk users, traders, managers, human resources, system administrators, people like that. But really, we need to recognize that all users pose risk. Often it's our low-risk users who are the gateway to attacks, and yet they're usually the last users that we protect. Tim, the admin assistant, has the same password for his Facebook account as his internal work accounts. Facebook gets breached, and now the attacker has a beachhead into your system, and they can use that to land and expand their present. They can escalate through more and more privileged users until they get where they want, or of course they could just go straight ahead and plant some ransomware onto your system, which is always a fun one to deal with. And the nightmare scenario, of course, is that you have a high-risk user who's not aware of or more typically just doesn't practice good cyber hygiene. They can make it really, really easy for an attacker. So given that MFA solves for many attack avenues, has been proven to massively reduce the chances of a successful identity-based breach, why is it only 11%? Why is it only 11% of these enterprise accounts that get protected by it? And that's typically because of the hurdles in doing so. There are many, many hurdles to implementing an MFA, and it can be costly in more ways than one. Falling productivity, users being frustrated by the number of different steps they need to perform, and obviously increasing help desk tickets as well can really plague organizations who implement clunky MFA systems. And if you place barriers in the user's way, then the users can be surprisingly inventive about getting around those barriers, and that can often cause even bigger security problems than just their credentials did. I'm sure we've all experienced or heard of users leaving USB authenticator fobs plugged into machines for convenience, or even calling across the office to get someone to read out a code from an SMS so that they can share a login to a SaaS application. So really what you need is some way of adding protection across all of your users without impacting their ability to just get on with their day, without them being frustrated by authentication, and of course, without overloading your authentication teams and support teams. And one way that we can solve that problem and make MFA easier is by using biometrics. And usually when people refer to biometrics, they're referring to static biometrics, scans of faces, retinas, fingerprints, that kind of thing. And the great benefit of those, of course, is it's very difficult to leave your finger at home. And often the devices themselves are pretty easy to use, if they can be a little frustrating sometimes. But there are also many downsides of these types of authentications. Privacy is a big one. If a static biometric measure is stolen, then it can be impossible to change. There's been cases where biometric systems have been defeated by getting a fingerprint from high-resolution photographs and actually creating a fake finger. There was one a while back that used the same stuff they make gummy bears out of. And obviously, you only have 9 changes before you're taking off your shoes and socks to try and authenticate into your systems, which is obviously not ideal. There's also then more hardware to deploy. As we saw in the first rush to the work from home environment, specific hardware can be very expensive to acquire, distribute, and then of course you have to support it in the long term as well. And then with some of the phone-based solutions out there, really you're just handing off that authentication of your users and relying on the security of a specific device, be that a fingerprint reader on a Samsung phone or Face ID on an Apple, or sometimes even just the user having a PIN to protect their phone, which is really just an even lower entropy password. So here at Plurilock, we try and do things a bit differently. We want to provide solutions that are invisible unless there's something wrong. With nothing to carry, nothing to lose, and really nothing to do for the user. So we created an MFA that uses behavioral biometrics. What do we mean by behavioral biometrics? Well, at a high level, it measures how a user behaves over time, typically through an interaction with their workstation. So when it comes to authenticating a user, for example, the way that user types is very unique to them. The tiny micro patterns and speeds in which they move between keys, how long they hold keys down for, and so on, is a really effective fingerprint of that person. It's a combination of multiple physical factors: the length of their fingers, how their wrists work, the ways their muscles and tendons and so on are set up. So we use these behavioral biometrics to authenticate users. And when you get the power of Gluu and you add in Plurilock's behavioral biometric solutions, you really get better authentication, and it's all powered by machine learning in the back end, and I'm sure we'll talk about that during questions. And really, it's all about making sure that the right person is accessing accounts in the right context. So the behavioral biometrics of the user confirms that not only is it actually a human sat there and not some kind of bot or script, but it's the right human that you expect to be using those credentials. And then we can overlay that with other signals. So we look at environmental data. We can look at your location and your location velocity. Are you somewhere where we expect you to be? And could you have physically got to that location given where we saw you last time? We look at other factors such as device fingerprinting, IP addressing, and so on. And that allows us to confirm the electronic and network context of those users as well. And all of these different factors can then be combined together to give you really strong multi-factor authentication protection for your users without the user really having to do anything. Behavioral biometrics are also very privacy friendly. Because we're just looking at the timing patterns of how you type a specific credential, there's nothing really that ties that biometric to you as an individual. It's just how you type that credential. We don't even know what the credential is. So should your profile somehow get compromised by simply changing your password, any biometric that we had for you is now completely irrelevant. It can't be used to generate an attack. It can't be traced back to you. And obviously, it's much easier to change your password than it is to change your fingerprints. So in terms of where it sits in the whole Gluu ecosystem, this example here shows the Gluu and Plurilock connected together to an Azure AD domain service, and that's actually synced to an on-premise Active Directory as well. And this is how the demo that I'm going to show you shortly is hooked together. But really, we can support whatever Gluu supports in terms of identity providers and stores and services and so on. So it's very, very easy to plug into your ecosystem. And then the overall process is pretty straightforward. So the user logs in using their Gluu identity, and our plugin sits in that authentication page and measures the biometric and contextual factors. And then once the credential itself is validated, the data gets passed to our adapt service, and that confirms the validity of the user's biometric and contextual data. And if everything looks good, the user is authenticated and they're into their application with no additional steps needed. They just logged in. If there's some risk, i.e. we see something wrong about how that user is logging in, then the user can be directed to a more traditional step-up authentication process. We have our own mobile push application that you can use, or if you already have an existing MFA that you want to leverage, you can actually fall back to using that in those situations where the user was not able to be authenticated invisibly. So I'm going to go ahead and give you a demo of this now. So I'm going to log into a Gluu account that's protected by Plurilock. And as I mentioned, this is all hooked up in our lab between Gluu, Active Directory, Azure AD, and Plurilock. So there's quite a few moving pieces in here. So let's go ahead and show you this. Okay, so we've got a standard Gluu login page here, and this has got the Plurilock Adapt plugin installed into it. And that Adapt plugin is going to measure the way that I enter my credentials, and then it's going to also provide the contextual data from my machine and pass that off to the server for analysis, assuming that my credentials are correct. So if I go ahead and log in here, you'll see that we've just logged straight into the Gluu dashboard here. So if I go ahead and log this out now, and this time I'm going to repeat the process, but I'm just going to type with 2 fingers, and that's going to simulate a change in my behavior. I could get someone else to come and sit here, but obviously with the current things, I can't do that. So I'm going to log in here just with 2 fingers. So this time, even though the credentials haven't changed, you'll see that I've been prompted for a step up. So I would now need to reach out to my phone and have a typical push kind of notification MFA experience. But most of the time, I just log in with my credentials, I behave normally, and it just lets me in invisibly with no additional steps, but still protecting that login by using an MFA. So obviously that was recorded because we don't need any demo fun and games, but all that magic is surprisingly simple to get. Really, it's 3 steps and you're good to go. You copy the files into your Gluu server. There's a bit of configuration that you do around setting up the authentication scripts and default authentication methods, and you're good to go. You're protected by our behavioral MFA solution. And then from the end user's perspective, they just log in as normal and we look after the rest. If we need to step up for some reason, then the user can be directed to their appropriate app store. They can install the mobile authenticator app, go through the self-registration process and so on. Or as I mentioned earlier, we can hook up to an existing MFA if you already have one in your stack that you'd maybe like to use a little bit less. You know, if you want to look at hardware-based tokens and just make them less annoying, this is a great way of just reducing the reliance on those. And then a little bit about Plurilock. So as well as the Adapt solution that we've looked at today, we also have the ability to continuously and invisibly authenticate your users all day long using their keyboard and mouse for behavioral biometrics. We authenticate these users in the background based on how they're interacting with their workstations every few seconds, and it's really a unique offering in the market. Defend really fills those gaps in authentication that exist today, particularly as a compensating control for any remote users where you don't really know who could be operating a computer in a home office, for example. You know, imagine being able to confidently know that user really is that user and that they have been that user all day long. So this can really help you if you're looking to do things like zero trust environments. And really what we can provide is the answer to the question, is this really you, all day long, which is obviously a vital tool in this new era. And one of the things that you can look at is using Defend as well as a signal to power your SSO. So rather than just granting a user access based on some token on their machine, you can actually say, well, is this really the user before I go ahead and let them in? So lots of kind of fun things you can do with those kinds of solutions as well. So just a quick summary of the things that we've looked at today. Obviously, risk is increasing. Everyone knows that. There's more and more breaches that are exposing credentials all the time. And unfortunately, users are often helping, should we say, with their cyber hygiene habits. And it's not their fault. It's just those things that happen. And to at least address some of those risks, you really should be adding some kind of MFA to your employee accounts to prevent at least most of those credential-based attacks. But there are many challenges with MFA solutions today: friction, frustration for your employees, just things that make it hard for them. And anytime you make it hard for your employee, well, it's not going to work for them. So one potential solution here is that you can add Gluu and Plurilock together to give you stronger, frictionless MFA that's all powered by our behavioral biometrics. And that's all I have in terms of slides. Happy to look at questions.
Yeah, so we can take some questions. I had some questions just off the bat. How long does it take to get a good enrollment? How many times would the user have to enter their password before you have a good template?
Yep. So we use 10 samples to enroll a user. So for the first 10 times they log in, you can do it in two ways. You can either do it actively where you reach out to their phone during that enrollment process to make sure it's them, or you can actually do it passively and just measure it 10 times. You get a better result, obviously, with doing it actively because you know for sure that you have the user sat there. But yeah, it's 10 samples to build that initial profile. And then on the 11th, you're going to be authenticated biometrically.
I see. And is there an active enrollment process where you go in and you type your password in 10 times, or do you just set a threshold and say, well, we're not going to check the behavioral template for the first 10 logins or something?
It's really up to you. What we want to do is we want to learn what's normal for that user. And if you go in there and you just type your password 10 times in quick succession, then that's not typically how you type it, right? As you get to the 10th one, you're probably a lot faster typing it and a different cadence overall to the first one that you did. So we generally recommend that you do everything in a real way. So you just kind of organically let the user log in 10 times to get a good sample of how they would typically log into that application.
Yeah, we have a question from the audience. The question is, users sometimes use the browser or LastPass to store passwords and autofill. Would you have to disable the autofill feature for this to work?
Yeah, you can. I mean, a kind of worst case, then the users will just step up and you'd have a more traditional MFA experience for them. But really, a lot of these password managers and browser caching and things like that are really to get around the problem that passwords are difficult. And if you overlay a password with behavioral biometrics, then the credential itself becomes less important. So it doesn't necessarily need to be complex, and it's the complex part that people have trouble with, right? Remembering where did they put the exclamation mark or the number 2 in a particular password. So if you are having a compensated control on your password complexity, such as our solution, you can actually relax those rules and you can make passwords easier for users. So rather than having a 10-digit complex password, you could maybe have a 15-digit natural language password where the way that the user types that becomes the way of validating that credential and not just the credential itself.
I see. Is there a certain length of password that helps? I imagine if you just have a 2-character password, it's probably hard to get much data. Is there certain guidelines on password length?
Yeah, I mean, we recommend kind of 14 characters or up. Obviously, longer is stronger. Both for the behavioral piece and for the credential itself in terms of brute forcing them. So yeah, 14 characters or so is a good place to start from. But as I said, because it doesn't need to be complex, it's actually easier for the user to be able to type those kinds of phrases.
I see. I just want to add, so this script will be available in the Gluu GitHub, and we could include this in Gluu 4.3 out of the box, so customers will already have the script ready to go. And I imagine they'll have to put in some things like API key and secret, but I think that we could included as a sort of a good starting point.
Awesome. Yeah, it's super straightforward to get it up and running. It's we're really excited to be working with the folks at Gluu.
What types of customers have you seen, or sort of what's your target audience or market for adoption?
We've been focused very much on the financial market, but really anywhere where you've got particularly regulatory pressure saying that you must have MFA and you must have it across all users. We find it's a really good fit there because most of these organizations have looked at existing MFA solutions out there and they've realized that they're just not going to work for them, right? They're either too complex to implement, they rely on the users doing too many steps, they're too annoying, or they're too expensive to actually deploy and use. So we've seen really good success in those kinds of areas, where it's regulatory driven, and yet there's no simple way for them to solve those regulatory pressures.
Right. Right. Well, I really like these kinds of technologies because you're not asking users to change their behavior most of the time, and it's using sort of the context and trying to do anomaly detection, and I think that's really interesting and um, really a good solution for a lot of different types of businesses, especially for employees who are employee facing, let's say, rather than customer facing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Any time you make things difficult for a user, then you cause a lot of pain right the way across the organization. So anything you can do to make that whole authentication thing easier and yet more secure is a good thing to do.
Right, and the deployment is also a big consideration. I know people tend to say, well, users complain a lot about 2FA, but I find that actually one of the biggest challenges is how easy is it to deploy, and the API mechanism, offering it as a SaaS really makes it pretty easy. So I think
Yep.
that's really a big concern. Okay, well, I don't see any more questions. So, Paul, anything you want to add before we conclude?
No, I just want to thank everyone that's joined in. I hope you found what we talked about today interesting. And obviously, if you want to dig into it a little bit deeper, then don't hesitate to reach out to me.
Okay, and there's an FAQ on Plurilock's website, and we're going to send out a link to this recording and some other helpful links after this. So thank you for everyone who joined, and have a great day.
Thanks, Sue.